Hi everybody, Mrs. Bullen here, and we're going to continue looking at Learning Target 4.4. I can write equations of parallel and perpendicular lines. We've already discussed parallel lines in a previous video, so in this video we'll talk about perpendicular lines. So for perpendicular lines, we can draw a quick sketch. Perpendicular lines are going to intersect, and they're going to intersect in a specific way where they meet at 90 degrees. So you can draw two lines intersecting, and we should add this square tick mark to show that these lines intersect at a 90-degree right angle. And we'll work with 90-degree angles quite a bit in geometry. I'll also make a note here that these perpendicular lines intersect at a 90-degree right angle. They intersect at a 90-degree right angle. Let's say something about the slopes of perpendicular lines. So for perpendicular lines, let's say that their slopes are opposite. I'm going to use a new word here, reciprocals. Opposite reciprocals. Well, what are opposite reciprocals? Let's give you a generic answer, and then let's do an example using numbers. So let's say your original slope was A over B. The opposite reciprocal would mean you do the opposite sign. So if it was positive, it would turn to negative. And if your fraction was A over B, the reciprocal piece means we flip it. So now it's B over A. If we want to do an example with numbers, let's say you had the fraction 5 over 7. The opposite piece means we would do opposite sign. If it was positive, it turns to negative, and vice versa. If it was negative to begin with, it would turn positive. And the reciprocal means flip it. So instead of 5 over 7, we now have 7 over 5. So opposite sign, and then the reciprocal piece means flip it. So I'll sometimes hear students say opposite flip to remind you opposite sign and flip your fraction. So for part B, perpendicular lines, for our warm-up, we're asked to find the slope of a line perpendicular to each of these given lines. So for finding slope, that means that our answer is going to be m equals. And for our given line, if we were finding a slope that's parallel to it or the same as it, it would be 1/4. But we need to do the opposite reciprocal slope. We can make a note up here. Since it's perpendicular to the given line, we need to do the opposite reciprocal, or opposite flip. So if my slope was a positive, it's going to become a negative. And then for the reciprocal part, I need to flip it. Instead of 1 over 4, it'll become 4 over 1. And we can reduce this. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 divided by 1 gives us negative 4. So negative 4 would be the opposite reciprocal slope to 1/4. If we look at the next warm-up, the slope given to us here is a negative 1. Or you can think of that as negative 1 over 1. We need to do the opposite reciprocal. So if it was negative, it's going to turn to positive. And 1 over 1, it's really just staying the same, right? 1 over 1. So the perpendicular slope or opposite reciprocal slope would be a positive 1. And then for the last warm-up, this equation's not in slope-intercept form. So before we can identify the slope, we need to get it in slope-intercept form. So first, I'm going to need to move this x to the other side. So I can subtract x from both sides. I'll get negative 5y equals, and I'll have negative x minus 10. Review of this skill, that I'm not combining negative 10, which is a constant term, and negative x, which is a variable term. I'm just leaving it negative x and negative 10. My last step here to get y by itself, if this is negative 5 times y, then I need to do the inverse operation, and I need to divide by negative 5 on every single term. I'll get y equals This is negative x divided by negative 5, or you can think of that as negative 1x divided by negative 5. Negative divided by negative is a positive, so we have 1/5 x. And then negative 10 divided by negative 5 gives me a positive 2. So here's the equation in slope-intercept form. So the slope we're looking at is 1/5. So if I'm asked to find the slope, was 1/5, but now I need to do the opposite reciprocal. So now it's going to turn to a negative. Flip it, so 5/1. And then I can simplify that. So my opposite reciprocal slope will be negative 5. Let's jump into our examples. We are asked to write the slope-intercept form of the equation of the line described. So I'm given a point, x comma y, and I'm told it needs to be perpendicular to this line. So I can make a note. I'm going to write op recip as a note for myself that I need to do the opposite reciprocal slope from what I see here. So if our slope is 1, I need to do the opposite reciprocal slope. So opposite, meaning if it was positive, it'll turn negative, and I would need to flip it. So my opposite reciprocal slope is going to be negative 1. And we are asked to write slope-intercept form. So I always like to write my slope-intercept form. And a reminder, we have two unknowns or two variables that we need to plug in to our slope-intercept form. We need to plug in the slope and we need to plug in the y-intercept. And I just found my slope. My slope is negative 1. So I found half of what I need to plug in. Now I need to find the y-intercept. So I have a slope I can plug in, and I also have an x and a y value I can plug in. So I'll pull my y value from my ordered pair. It's negative 1. My slope, we said the opposite reciprocal slope was negative 1. This is m times x, so I'm using parentheses to indicate multiplication. My x value comes from the ordered pair. It's negative 2. Close my parentheses, and then I have plus b at the end. And we should have plus b because this is what we need to find. This is our variable. We're trying to find our y-intercept. I can simplify this multiplication. So I have negative 1 equals negative 1 times negative 2 gives me a positive 2 plus b. And I'm very close to having b by itself. I want this to read b equals, but I have this positive 2 in the way. I'd like to move this positive 2 to the other side, so I can move a positive 2 by subtracting 2 over to the other side. And I'll get b equals negative 1 minus 2 gives me negative 3. So now I found my other unknown. My b is negative 3. Found my slope. Found my y-intercept. So my final answer is to write it in slope-intercept form. So y equals mx, so negative 1x plus my b, so plus a negative 3. And we don't have to write the 1 here. You could also write your equation like this, negative x minus 3. Both would be acceptable. Here is an equation in slope-intercept form for a line that is perpendicular to this given line. Notice it has opposite reciprocal slope, and it's going to go through this point. Our last example, example 4, I'm given a point, and I'm told that it needs to be perpendicular to this line. So if I want to make a note for myself, I need to do the opposite reciprocal slope. So here, if the slope was negative 3, I need to do the opposite. You can think of this as negative 3/1. So it needs to turn to positive. And instead of doing 3/1, I'll flip it and I'll get 1/3. So the slope that I need to use is 1/3. I can write my slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. We know we have two unknowns we need to plug in. We need to find our slope and find our y-intercept. Halfway done, I found my slope. Now I need to find my y-intercept. So I'll plug in my x, my y, and my slope. So my y value comes from the ordered pair. It's negative 3 equal to my slope of 1/3 times my x value of 3, close my parentheses, plus b can take care of this multiplication. So I have negative 3 equals 1/3 times 3, or this is like saying 1/3 times 3 over 1. That just simplifies to 1. Feel free to use your calculator if you need to. Plus b. I need to move this positive 1 over to the other side. I can do that by subtracting 1, and I get that b equals negative 4. So now I know my y-intercept. I have my 2 unknowns that I need to plug in. So I'll have y equals mx, so 1/3 x, plus my b, which is negative 4. So here's slope-intercept form of an equation that's perpendicular to this line, and it'll end up going through this point on the graph. This time you've got one U-try. Go ahead, pause the video, and see what you come up with. Let's check your U-try. On this one, my opposite reciprocal slope was negative 1/2. So opposite sign, it was positive, so it turns to negative. Instead of doing 2 over 1, we're going to flip it and do 1 over 2. So I found half of what I needed. The other unknown is I need to find my y-intercept. So by plugging in x, y, and my slope, I get that my y-intercept, my b, is negative 6. So my final answer is y equals negative 1/2 x minus 6.